morning mist clung low over Arlington, like breath held in prayer, and Staff Sergeant Blake Hassan moved through it with ritual precision, his boots clicking in perfect rhythm against black mat and stone, as if each strike of leather were a metronome for memory itself. 21 measured strides, a pause, a turn, then the return. The tomb of the unknown soldier stood pale and unwavering before him, marble bright under a thin gray sky, and the gathered crowd watched in a silence so complete it felt less like quiet and more like reverence made visible. He stood 6'2" in full sentinel uniform, broad-shouldered and carved hard by years of discipline, his face an unreadable mask beneath the kepi hat's sharp brim. Every crease on his jacket sat sharp enough to cut glass. His white gloves remained pristine. The brass on his chest held dawn's thin light without a smudge. Even from 40 feet away, tourists could see the mirror polish of his shoes and the exactness of the rifle in his hands. An M14 held with the kind of steadiness that made stillness look like strength weaponized. To the first-time visitors gathered behind the chain, he looked almost unreal, a figure pulled from ceremony and fixed into stone. To the veterans in the crowd, he looked exactly like what he was, a living promise. A boy no older than 10, wearing a baseball cap embroidered with a branch insignia, too large for his head, tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered, "Does he ever blink?" His mother crouched beside him, hand resting on his shoulder, voice barely above breath. "He blinks. He just never breaks." Near them, a retired sergeant major, with a weathered face and a cane hooked at his elbow, stood with his chin lifted, jaw tight, eyes wet and unashamed. Beside him, his wife held a folded program against her coat, as if it were a hymn book in church. A group of high school cadets in pressed uniforms stood with their phones lowered at their sides, forgotten for once. Two sisters in their 20s, one in a wheelchair wrapped in a navy blanket, watched without speaking. An elderly man in a Korea-era cap held the brim between thumb and forefinger every time Blake turned at the 21st step, as if he were saluting from muscle memory rather than decision. The cadence continued. 21 steps. Pause. Turn. 21 steps. The wind moved through the rows of white headstones below the terrace, and the markers seemed to stretch into forever, each one an answer to a question no living citizen should ever ask lightly. What did freedom cost this family, this town, this generation? That was the force Blake carried in his chest while his expression remained carved and still. He did not look left or right. He did not acknowledge the crowd, his eyes locked on a point only he could see, and yet he registered everything around him with a vigilance sharpened far beyond ceremony. The flutter of a coat in peripheral vision, the weight shift of a man stepping too near the line, the tremor in a child's breath when a parent began to cry quietly. He absorbed all of it without showing a fraction. At 31, Blake had learned to divide himself with surgical discipline. One part of him was visible. Measured posture, exact stride length, controlled arms, ceremonial rifle movements delivered on count, and without flaw. The other part was interior and relentless, a combat veteran's awareness that never stood down. The crowd witnessed perfection. What they did not see was a mind continuously calculating, indexing, scanning, and honoring all at once, because at this post there was no such thing as autopilot. Every step was chosen, every pause was deliberate, every turn was a vow renewed in real time. A pair of tourists from the Midwest, judging by their accents and matching rain jackets, leaned close to one another near the back rail. "He makes it look easy," the husband murmured. His wife shook her head slowly. "That's not easy." That's control. Her words drifted and vanished into the morning, but they landed true. Control was the heart of it. Control in weather that soaked wool and stiffened fingers. Control in August heat that turned the plaza into a mirror of rising shimmer. Control under eyes that watched for spectacle, while the sentinel offered only duty. Blake had stood this mat in cold that numbed knuckles beneath white gloves, and in summer glare that made vision swim, and each day he met the same standard because the dead did not get weather breaks. Honor did not rotate on convenience. At the far edge of the crowd, a father lifted his young daughter so she could see over the shoulders in front of her. She wore a red coat with brass buttons and clutched a small souvenir flag in one hand. With the other hand, she pointed toward Blake's shoes as he pivoted. "He's marching for somebody," she whispered, uncertain whether she was asking a question. "For all of them," her father answered, voice rough. "For the ones with no one left to call their names." The child nodded with the seriousness only children can summon in sacred places, then pressed the flag against her chest as if she understood more than language could hold. Blake did not turn toward them, but on his next pass he registered the motion, filed it, and kept his pace exact. The ritual count continued, measured and unbroken. A light drizzle began, almost too fine to notice, silvering the black mat and deepening the color of uniforms in the crowd. No one moved for cover. Umbrellas remained closed. Even visitors who had arrived chatty and restless settled into the discipline of the place, drawn into its gravity by the man walking the line. Arlington had a way of teaching posture without instruction. Shoulders straightened, voices lowered, phones disappeared. A sacred geometry took hold. Marble, flag, sentinel, witness. Blake felt the first cool bead of rain touch the bridge of his nose and never blinked at it. His breathing remained even. His hands remained fixed with exact pressure on rifle stock and sling. He had performed these motions thousands of times, but repetition had never turned them hollow. If anything, repetition made the meaning heavier, because each perfect cycle tied him tighter to those who could no longer stand their own watch. He carried names he never spoke at the tomb, names known and unknown, friends and strangers folded into one responsibility. The crowd saw protocol. He felt kinship. A teenager in a Letterman jacket, likely dragged here by family at first, stood near the rail with both hands in his pockets until an older veteran beside him quietly removed his own hat as Blake turned. The teenager noticed, hesitated, then took his cap off too. No one instructed him, no one applauded him. Yet his spine straightened and his gaze stopped drifting. By the next cycle, he stood at full attention without fully realizing he had done it. That was another part of the Sentinel's task few people named aloud. Not only to honor the dead, but to call the living upward. The drizzle thickened for a moment, then eased. Gray light brightened across the marble face of the tomb, and the inscription seemed to float in the mist. "Here rests in honored glory an American soldier known but to God." Those words had been read by millions. Blake had passed them countless times. They never became ordinary. To him they were not inscription, but command. 3 paces from his turn point, his peripheral vision caught a small movement near the front line. A little girl stepping forward from her mother's side, then stopping exactly where the rail instructed. She was a little girl of 6, with dark curls tucked under a knit cap and a tiny green plastic soldier clutched in her fist so tight the toy's helmet edge pressed into her palm. Her coat sleeves were a little long, swallowing her wrists. She watched Blake with the focus of someone trying to memorize him. Her mother knelt, smoothing the girl's shoulder gently. "Ava, stay right here." Ava nodded, but did not take her eyes off the sentinel. When Blake reached the end of his next 21, paused and turned, the girl raised the toy soldier halfway, then lowered it again, uncertain. She glanced up at her mother. "Can I give it to him?" she whispered. Her mother's face changed at the question, grief and pride moving through it in one breath. "Not while he's walking, sweetheart." Ava looked back at Blake, then at the tomb, then down at the little plastic figure in her glove. "He looks lonely," she said. Her mother swallowed hard and placed a hand over her daughter's small fist. "He isn't alone." Blake heard none of the words clearly at that distance, but he read the exchange in posture, in the child's raised hand, in the mother's steadying touch. He carried the image through the next pass, and through the next. In a life measured by orders and coordinates, some moments arrived without rank and still hit with the weight of artillery. A child offering a toy soldier to a man guarding the unknown dead was one of those moments. It threaded straight through the armor he kept hidden under discipline. 10 minutes into that watch, the crowd had become a single body of witness. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder with tourists. Children quieted. Parents leaned close. Even those who came curious left changed in ways they would only understand on the ride home. The Sentinel's rhythm had done its work. It had reminded them that this hillside was not a backdrop and not a destination pinned on a map, but a covenant maintained one measured step at a time. Blake completed another cycle, halted at center, and executed the turn with mechanical perfection, shoulders square, chin level, rifle angle exact. Rain traced down the polished wood stock and vanished into white glove cotton. His expression did not shift. His heartbeat remained controlled. Inside him, memory and duty stood side by side like brothers at attention. Then the morning detail rotated, and as relief personnel approached from the flank, the crowd remained silent until the transition was complete. Only after Blake marched off the mat in flawless cadence did breath return to the terrace in a collective exhale. People began to move again, slowly, as if leaving a sanctuary. Ava watched him go, still holding the toy soldier to her chest, eyes following the white gloves, until he disappeared behind the ceremonial line, and in that small gaze lay a promise neither she nor anyone else on the plaza could yet name. That unnamed promise found its first test while the rain was still drying on Blake Hassan's sleeves. He cleared the ceremonial line with the same measured bearing he had held on the mat, exchanged his rifle under supervision, and stepped into the service corridor behind the plaza where duty shifted from marble silence to moving orders. A military police lieutenant met him there, with a clipboard pressed flat against his chest, and urgency held tight behind protocol. A dignified transfer had been moved up at Reagan National's military annex, family already in place, escort team short one senior man due to a medical pull. Blake gave one crisp acknowledgement, signed in, and turned without wasted motion. By the time he crossed the vehicle bay, Arlington's mist had become the hard, metallic smell of wet pavement and diesel, and the sacred stillness of the tomb had narrowed into the kind of operational focus that left no room for anything except sequence, timing, and respect. 23 minutes later, the airport corridor stood under fluorescent light that erased softness from every surface. Jet fuel drifted faintly through ventilation vents. Rolling announcements echoed from distant gates, muffled by cinder block walls and temporary barricades. Military police had strung a controlled lane from secure vehicle access to the transfer point, ropes anchored in chrome stanchions, every angle designed to protect a final journey from crowd pressure and camera chaos. Gold Star families stood in pressed black coats near the rail, shoulders touching without speaking. A TSA supervisor held her cap in both hands and looked straight ahead as if at attention. 4 high school JROTC cadets waited near the back with faces gone solemn and phones tucked out of sight. An elderly man in a Korea cap leaned on a cane beside a woman in a Purple Heart jacket, both of them still as carved wood. The corridor had all the tension of a sanctuary built inside machinery. Blake took his station on the rope line at the critical choke point where impatience usually surfaced first. His uniform was immaculate despite weather and transit, every crease still sharp enough to cut glass, white gloves pristine, brass catching the sterile airport light without a single dull edge. To most passing travelers, he looked ceremonial, another formal detail in a federal space too busy for reverence. To the people who had gathered for the transfer, he looked like a wall that had learned to stand for the dead. His face stayed unreadable. His eyes tracked in disciplined arcs. Entry doors, stairwell, lane gap, family cluster, team leaders' hand signals, return points, threat vectors. Outwardly, he was stillness. Internally, he was calibrated, velocity held in reserve. Then he saw her again. Ava Monroe stood near the interior rail with her mother, dark curls escaping from a knit cap now damp at the edges. Tiny green plastic infantryman clutched in her palm like a talisman. She wore the same red coat with brass buttons, and the solemn concentration in her 6-year-old face had deepened into something older than her years. Her mother's eyes were rimmed raw from a day that had already required too much strength, yet her posture remained straight and deliberate, one hand resting lightly on Ava's shoulder every time footsteps sounded in the hall. Blake did not alter expression, did not break bearing, but he registered the details with perfect clarity, including the child's instinctive glance toward him every few seconds, as if checking whether the sentinel from the marble terrace had truly followed them into this harsher world of concrete, scanners, and steel doors. At 10:14, the violation arrived in a charcoal suit worth more than most family sedans. Victor Klein came through the side access lane with 2 assistants, 1 airport liaison, and the tempo of a man who believed schedules bent around his name. Gold cufflinks flashed at his wrists each time he cut the air with his hands. His jaw was tight, his smile gone thin with entitlement, and his voice carried before he reached the rope. "I have a summit in 40 minutes. Move this lane. Now." The liaison whispered that the corridor was locked for military transfer protocol, and Klein snapped back loud enough for 3 rows of witnesses to hear. "You are delaying federal business for theater." He stepped up to the barrier, looked Blake over once from kepi to shoeshine, and let contempt sharpen his mouth. "You, parade prop, take the rope down." No one moved. The corridor held. Blake's answer came in measured cadence, 1 sentence, no heat. "Sir, this lane is restricted." Klein laughed once, flat and incredulous, then shoved forward with his forearm against the rope. The stanchion rocked and clanged against tile, bright as a struck bell. Ava flinched. Her toy soldier slipped, caught, then fell when Klein's sleeve clipped her wrist. The plastic skittered across polished floor and spun to a stop under the rope inside the transfer lane. A gasp broke from somewhere in the crowd. A TSA agent took 1 step, halted, and looked to military police for command. The JROTC cadets froze where they stood. The elderly man in the Korea cap tightened his grip on his cane until his knuckles blanched. Ava stared at the floor, lower lip trembling, eyes wide, not with panic, but with the stunned confusion of a child watching adults fail the rules she thought were fixed. Klein did not look down. He drove his heel forward and kicked the toy aside as if clearing debris. "I said move him," he barked to airport security, pointing at Blake. I'm not being blocked by a costume guard. The corridor went silent in the way only a truly wrong act can force it silent. What Klein did not know was standing directly in front of him in white gloves and ceremonial brass. He did not know the man he had dismissed had spent 2 tours in Afghanistan, reading ambush geometry and dust and shadow, had run an advisory rotation in Syria, where hesitation cost names, had carried wounded men through fire corridors while shrapnel burned through flesh at his left ribs. He did not know this sentinel's stillness was not passivity but discipline, forged in violence and refined in grief. He did not know Blake Hassan had learned to detect escalation in the first shift of shoulders, the first hand twitch toward a pocket, the first narrowing of breath before a bad decision crossed into harm. He did not know he had just insulted the one man in the terminal least likely to be moved by money, volume, or social gravity. Seconds stretched. Blake stood motionless, but every instinct inside him was on high alert, not for pride, not for insult, but for lane integrity, family safety, and the exact timing of a transfer detail carrying one more American home under flag. His eyes measured Klein's stance, the distance to Ava, the toy's new position inside restricted space, the line of sight of cameras mounted overhead, and the approach vector of federal police already signaled by a clipped transmission at the edge of his hearing. The crowd could not see those calculations. They saw only a sentinel and a billionaire, white gloves and gold cufflinks. Duty and arrogance locked one breath apart with a child's toy soldier lying between them like a question that demanded an answer. The answer did not come yet. Instead, the moment held like a drawn wire, and the story itself seemed to pull back from the terminal lights and fixed faces to mark what this was really about. Not celebrity, not wealth, not spectacle, but whether honor still had guardians in places where hurry and ego claimed every inch of ground. The family at the rail stood inside private grief. Veterans in the corridor stood inside old memory. Cadets stood inside a lesson they would carry for decades. Blake stood inside a vow older than this argument and heavier than this man's timetable. Even Ava, 6 years old with one gloved hand now empty, stood inside that same moral geometry without having words for it. The scene had become larger than logistics. It had become a test. Now, before we dive into this story, where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe that values like honor, courage, and sacrifice still matter, join us in keeping their legacy alive. Then the corridor snapped back into focus, fluorescent glare and all, with Victor Klein's hand still extended in demand, Ava's toy soldier still displaced inside a restricted lane, and Staff Sergeant Blake Hassan still at post, unreadable, unflinching, and one disciplined breath away from the move that would force every person in that terminal to decide what they believed honor was worth. He did not move. The fluorescent lights hummed above the transfer corridor with the indifferent buzz of machinery. But beneath that sterile sound lay a silence that belonged to sanctuaries, not airports. The polished tile reflected white gloves, black shoes, chrome stanchions, and the rigid geometry of a lane built for honor. Jet fuel drifted faintly through the vents. Somewhere beyond the sealed doors, a baggage cart clattered and faded. Here, inside this narrow passage of rope and protocol, every breath seemed to wait for permission. Blake Hassan stood at the choke point as if he had been cast there in iron. Kepi brim level, chin square, shoulders locked. Jacket seams sat in strict alignment from collar to cuff, every crease sharp enough to cut glass under the hard terminal light. His brass insignia held a controlled gleam, not showy, simply exact. White gloves remained pristine despite rain, transit, and strain. His shoes, polished to a mirror shine, caught flickers of movement from the crowd and gave nothing back. To hurried travelers glancing from afar, he might have looked ceremonial. To everyone inside that corridor, he looked like law. Across the rope, the witnesses formed a cross-section of the country he served. Ava Monroe stood closest, 6 years old in her red coat with brass buttons, one empty hand curled now where the toy soldier had been. Her mother, Elena Monroe, kept her palm firm on the child's shoulder, posture upright even as grief pulled at her face. Two Gold Star parents in black wool stood shoulder to shoulder near the wall, fingers interlaced so tightly their knuckles whitened. A TSA supervisor named Darla Finch held her cap against her chest and stared straight ahead, jaw set in visible restraint. 4 JROTC cadets in Navy uniforms stood in a line near the rear barricade, each one rigid with the effort to be grown before their time, phones silent in their pockets. The elderly man in the Korea cap leaned on a cane with both hands and did not blink, while beside him a woman in a Purple Heart jacket mouthed a prayer without sound. By 10:15, no one in that corridor was pretending this was a routine delay. The rope line itself became a symbol under pressure. Chrome feet braced against tile, braided cord still trembling from Victor Klein's shove. His charcoal suit sat flawless on a body that had never needed to wait. Gold cufflinks flashed each time he shifted, little bursts of purchased power against the matte black of mourning clothes and military uniforms. Behind him, his assistants hovered with tablets and phones, eyes flicking between him and the military police detail, calculating optics before ethics. The airport liaison who had escorted him in now stood 3 feet back, face drained, understanding that one wrong clearance had ignited a moral fire no statement could easily smother. And still, Blake remained still, because stillness was the first language of his office. That discipline had been visible hours earlier on the hill at Arlington, before steel doors and fluorescent glare, when morning mist had hung low among white headstones like breath held in prayer. The marble had looked almost luminous in that soft gray light. Rain had traced faint silver across black matting. Veterans had removed hats without being asked. Children had lowered voices they did not yet know how to lower anywhere else. The wind had moved through the rows of markers and carried the quiet with it. In that place, history was not recited. It was inhabited. Blake had walked his 21 steps, paused, turned, and repeated with the same precision, now holding this corridor together, because his duty never ended at the edge of the plaza. It traveled with him. He remembered specific faces from that morning as clearly as grid points on a map. The boy in the oversized branch cap asking if sentinels blinked. The mother answering, "He just never breaks." The retired sergeant major with wet eyes and a straight spine. The teenager who removed his hat when he saw an old veteran do it, then unconsciously came to attention by the next cycle. The father lifting his daughter in the red coat so she could see, telling her the sentinel marched for all of them. And Ava herself, dark curls tucked under knit wool, holding up a tiny green soldier, and whispering that he looked lonely. Her words had not reached Blake's ears from the mat, but their meaning had. Now that same child stood in a federal corridor with her offering kicked aside, and the sacred had followed her into the profane. Blake's eyes stayed forward, unreadable to the crowd, but his awareness swept in layered circuits. Klein's weight distribution over his lead foot, the angle of the rope gap, Ava's distance from the stanchion, Elena's balance if she moved quickly, camera coverage overhead, nearest MP response path, federal police approach timing relayed in clipped radio fragments at the edge of hearing. He did not need volume to recognize escalation. He needed vectors. He needed intent. He needed one clean second where duty, law, and safety aligned. And what no one in that corridor could fully see was the long road that had built that second inside him. At 19, Blake Hassan had entered the Army with a broad frame, a disciplined temperament, and a quiet conviction that service was not abstraction. He had grown up in a house where folded flags were treated with reverence, and where names of the fallen were spoken at dinner like family. He was not loud, not theatrical, not drawn to applause. In basic training, instructors noticed he learned fastest when others were most tired. In advanced infantry schooling, they noticed he could hold composure in noise. In his first unit, they noticed he listened before he spoke and moved when others froze. Men trusted him quickly, then stopped talking about it because in that profession, trust was less declared than tested. His first Afghanistan tour put him in Kunar province under a sky so bright it could bleach depth from the mountains and make distance a liar. Patrols were long, terrain unforgiving, and every bend in a road carried the possibility of a sudden decision with permanent consequences. Blake learned local rhythms, learned which silence in a village was ordinary and which felt staged, learned to read doorways, shadows, and rooftops as if they were sentences. On one spring patrol, an improvised device detonated 50 meters off their axis after a civilian truck drifted into their route. Blake rerouted his team through a dry irrigation cut, kept his men low, and coordinated extraction of 2 wounded soldiers while taking sporadic fire from a ridgeline. He did not call it heroism. He called it Tuesday. His platoon sergeant called it composure under fire. His second Afghanistan deployment came with rank, responsibility, and the heavier burden of being the man younger soldiers watched when things went wrong. He carried that burden without dramatics. He was not invulnerable. No one in that line of work was. But he was steady, and steady men became anchors. During one night movement near a wadi outside Kandahar, shrapnel from a mortar strike tore across his left side and carved a pale, diagonal scar below his ribs. He kept moving until everyone else was out of the kill zone, then accepted treatment only after confirming accountability count twice. The medic who cleaned and dressed the wound later told him, half irritated and half admiring, "You are stubborn in a way that should require paperwork." Blake had managed a brief, tired grin. "File it under operational necessity." Then came Syria. Advisory rotation, smaller teams, and tighter margins, where alliances shifted faster than maps, and restraint mattered as much as force. It was there that Staff Sergeant Marcus Hale became not just his teammate, but his brother in everything except blood. Hale was compact, fast, and endlessly human, even in bad conditions. He could make exhausted men laugh in blackout conditions with one dry remark, then be first through a breach the next hour. He kept photos of his daughter tucked inside a weathered notebook and spoke of her with a pride that softened his whole face. On a freezing evening after a 12-hour route clearance, when rations were cold and everyone was running on fumes, Hale dropped onto an ammo crate, looked at the miserable meal in his hands, and announced, "Gentlemen, welcome to the 5-star desert tasting menu. Tonight's special is disappointment with hints of cardboard." Even Blake laughed. It had been the kind of laugh that releases pressure without breaking discipline. Weeks later, on an extraction under contact near a broken industrial district, Hale took the rear security position while the team moved a wounded interpreter and 2 junior soldiers toward the vehicles. Fire snapped off concrete. Radios crackled. Time narrowed. Hale held that lane long enough for everyone else to clear, then caught rounds that ended his watch before medevac could close the gap. Blake reached him in the final minute, kneeling in dust and noise that seemed both deafening and far away. Hale was bleeding, breathing hard, but his eyes were calm. He gripped Blake's sleeve, managed a crooked half-smile, and said, "Tell my kid I still owe her a piggyback race." Then he was gone. Blake carried that sentence out of Syria like a shard that never left. Back stateside, he attended the funeral in dress uniform, stood with Hale's family, and watched a folded flag pass into small hands that did not yet understand inheritance of grief. Hale's daughter asked, in the clear voice of a child, whether her dad had been brave. Blake answered with full military bearing and a throat like iron wire. He was the bravest man in the street. It was true, but incomplete. Brave was too small for what had happened. No single adjective could hold that kind of giving. In the months that followed, Blake received formal recognition for combat actions, including a Bronze Star with V. But medals were never the center of his internal ledger. The real accounting was names, faces, promises. He requested assignment to the old guard not to escape the field, but to continue it in another register. At the tomb, he found the only duty that matched the gravity of what he carried: to stand for those whose stories ended before they could come home, and to do it with such precision that no one could mistake remembrance for performance. The Tomb Guard identification badge on his chest became, to him, both distinction and vow. That vow explained why he had noticed Ava earlier in the week, during a family visit at Arlington, when she lingered at the rail after the crowd thinned and held out her tiny plastic infantrymen with solemn ceremony. "For the lonely one," she had whispered. He could not accept objects on the mat. Protocol was protocol, and Elena had gently guided Ava's hand back. Blake did not speak then. Sentinels almost never did. But he inclined his head by a degree so slight, only someone looking for it would see. Ava had smiled as if she had been answered. Blake carried that moment forward like a live ember under armor. Now, in the corridor, he saw the same toy displaced inside restricted space, not as debris, but as symbol. It represented a child's instinct to honor what adults often rush past. It represented an unbroken thread between Arlington's marble silence and this fluorescent annex of schedules and friction. It represented the line Klein had crossed without understanding that some lines are not administrative. They are moral. Blake's breathing stayed even. His pulse remained controlled. Externally, his face was carved discipline. Internally, grief, memory, duty, and tactical calculus converged into one clean axis. He was not angry in the way civilians use the word. He was resolved. There was a fallen service member inbound. There was a family in mourning. There was a child watching. There was a corridor that would hold. Around him, witnesses felt the gravity even if they could not name each layer. Darla Finch from TSA straightened until her shoulders aligned with his. One JROTC cadet, freckles stark against pale skin, lifted his chin and locked his knees at parade rest. The elderly man in the Korea cap removed his hat with shaking fingers and pressed it over his heart. Eleanor Monroe leaned down just enough to whisper in Ava's ear, and Ava nodded once, eyes fixed on Blake as if she already understood that the man in white gloves was doing far more than standing in front of rope. From the side access door came the muted thud of boots and the clipped cadence of approaching command presence, still distant, still seconds away. Blake held his post, silent and unflinching, with the full weight of the named and the unknown at his back. Victor Klein pressed forward again at the cordon lane's edge, and the corridor seemed to contract around him. He was in his late 50s, silver at the temples, clean shave sharp as a briefing room slide. Charcoal suit tailored to erase any hint of softness, cufflinks gleaming yellow under fluorescent glare. His shoes were black calfskin, mirror bright, and his watch face flashed once when he lifted his hand to point at Blake, as if assigning a junior analyst to fetch coffee. Two assistants held position just behind him, with tablets clutched to their chests, one whispering into a headset, the other refreshing a schedule that no longer mattered in this room. A few paces back, an airport liaison with a laminated badge wore the face of someone already shifted from confidence to damage control. Klein's expensive cologne sat in the jet fuel air, a jarring note against wool coats and folded flags. People in that corridor recognized him. Not all by name, but by type. Money that expected passage. Power that mistook itself for permission. The Korea veteran at the rail narrowed his eyes and muttered to the woman beside him, "That's Klein. Defense contracts." The woman in the Purple Heart jacket answered without looking away from Blake. Then he should know better. He should have. His company logo sat on armored panels and logistics crates across multiple commands. His speeches at procurement conferences were clipped into industry reels. He appeared on magazine covers in dark suits with headlines about innovation and readiness, framed by aircraft and steel. On paper, he spoke fluent patriotism. In person, under friction, his body language told a different doctrine. He moved through people rather than around them. He spoke over uniforms he had never worn. He treated checkpoints like inconveniences designed for other men. At 10:16, the transfer corridor's digital wall clock changed by 1 minute, and Klein stabbed a finger toward it as if time itself were his witness. 12 minutes, he said, voice edged and carrying. You've already taken 12. No one answered. He threw his words at the airport liaison. My convoy has state and committee staff waiting on the other side of this runway. You will clear this lane now. The liaison tried once more, voice low and procedural. Sir, this is an active military transfer route. It cannot be opened. Klein's jaw flexed. He turned back to Blake and let contempt settle openly onto his face. You heard him. This delay is administrative. You are ceremonial. Move the rope. Blake's posture did not change by a degree. Sir, stand behind the barrier. The sentence landed like a steel pin driven into concrete. Short, final. No escalation in tone, no invitation to negotiate. Klein gave a small laugh for his own entourage, the kind used in boardrooms to shrink resistance. He spread his hands and looked around at the families as if seeking applause for common sense. We are blocking federal work for a pageant. A murmur moved through the crowd, then died quickly. The 4 JROTC cadets held still, but one swallowed hard, freckles stark under the lights. Darla Finch, from TSA, shifted 1 foot, then planted both feet shoulder-width and locked her gaze ahead. Elena Monroe's hand pressed more firmly on Ava's shoulder. Ava did not look at Klein. She looked at the green plastic soldier lying inside the restricted lane, as if willing it not to be where it was. Klein took another step. Chrome stanchion base scraped tile. The braided rope bowed and snapped back. He was not shouting now. He was pronouncing, as men do when they have spent years watching rooms bend around their deadlines. I run programs that keep this country armed, he said. I do not wait in hallways because somebody wants a photo op with a toy rifle. That line pulled a visible reaction from 3 different corners of the corridor at once. The elderly veteran's shoulders went rigid. One Gold Star father closed his eyes and exhaled through his nose, controlled and shaking. A cadet's hands clenched behind his back so hard his knuckles blanched. Klein noticed none of it, or treated none of it as relevant. He pointed to Blake's chest insignia with a dismissive flick. You're a parade boy in a polished costume. Don't confuse ceremony with authority. The fatal assumption stood there in plain language, fully formed for every witness to hear, that discipline was theater, that ritual meant weakness, that a man in white gloves existed to decorate power, not restrain it. Blake remained motionless. What Klein could see was a sentinel with perfect creases and formal bearing. What he could not see was the layered machinery behind that stillness. Combat memory indexed by distance and motion, legal thresholds memorized, protective response drills burned into muscle, and grief disciplined into service until it became a kind of calm that no volume could penetrate. Blake's instincts did not flare because he had been insulted. They sharpened because a child stood frightened, a family stood in mourning, and a protected route had been challenged by a man testing whether consequence still existed. Klein angled his body toward two airport officers at the rear and snapped, "Remove him." Neither officer moved. They looked instead to the military police sergeant at the corner. The sergeant's voice came clipped and clear. "Maintain positions." That refusal seemed to strike Klein harder than any shout. His nostrils flared. He rolled one shoulder, loosened his neck, then jabbed a finger toward the toy soldier near Blake's boot line. "And get that plastic trash off my path." Ava flinched at the words. Elena bent slightly, whispering at her daughter's ear. Ava nodded once, lips pressed thin, eyes wet but steady. She kept her small chin lifted toward Blake, and Blake registered it without turning his head. In that single child's posture, he saw a memory of Hale's daughter at graveside, trying to stand tall in borrowed black shoes while adults broke around her. The old shard in his chest shifted, but did not fracture discipline. It never did. 3 days earlier, during a quieter family pass-through near Arlington's visitor line, Blake had recognized Ava by the red coat and earnest stare, and noticed how carefully she held that same toy figure with both hands, as if carrying something official. He had filed the detail as he filed all details. Now the same object lay inside restricted space after being kicked by a man in imported leather shoes. In another setting, it would have been nothing. Here, it had become a marker for the entire confrontation. Innocence displaced by arrogance, honor tested by hurry. Klein tipped his chin toward Blake again. "Last time. Move." Blake's eyes stayed level. His breathing remained even. "Stand down, sir." The corridor's acoustics magnified the final word, and then sound collapsed into near silence. By 10:17, additional witnesses had collected at the far barricade as word traveled through adjoining gates. A pair of flight attendants stood shoulder to shoulder, hats in hand. A wheelchair-bound Vietnam veteran arrived with his adult son and stopped without asking questions. 2 baggage handlers in high-visibility vests removed their caps and held them against their chests. The crowd had become larger, but its behavior had become quieter, more ordered, as if the presence of one unmoving sentinel was teaching strangers how to stand in a sacred boundary, even inside an airport annex. Klein mistook that silence for uncertainty. He made a small, dismissive gesture toward Blake's uniform, then to the rope, then to his own chest, as if presenting a hierarchy anyone rational should accept. "I have clearances that outrank this hallway. I sign checks for units you'll never see. Do not make me call people above your pay grade." No one in uniform replied to the provocation. The military police sergeant simply touched 2 fingers to his earpiece and turned half an inch toward the side door where command presence was closing distance. Seconds lengthened. Blake felt the familiar compression that came before decisive action. The same dilation he had known in villages, alleyways, and loading zones. Peripheral detail brightened, sound narrowed, and the body became both heavy and precise. He tracked Klein's hands first. Empty. Right hand dominant. fingers tense. He tracked foot placement next. Lead foot pointed through the rope gap, weight beginning to shift forward. He tracked Ava. One step behind the rail, mother anchored, no immediate movement. He tracked the transfer team's timeline from signals at the far end. Inbound sequence unchanged, no delay authorized. He tracked cameras, overhead angle clear, side angle partially occluded by Klein's assistant, still sufficient for record. Externally, he was stone. Internally, every muscle was coiled with measured intent, not aggression. Shoulders set for block rather than strike. Left side guarded over old scar. Center line stable. Hands quiet at seam level, ready for control contact if threshold crossed. His training ran silent checklists faster than spoken language. Protect the family, protect the route, use minimum force, preserve dignity, hold law, hold honor. Klein looked past him now, trying to sight a path through the lane. You're delaying a national security meeting for a funeral procession. The words hit the gathered families like a cold wind. One Gold Star mother inhaled sharply and straightened to full height. Darla Finch's jaw hardened. She took one half-step toward Ava and then stopped, respecting line discipline while signaling readiness. A cadet at the rear whispered, barely audible. He said, procession. The Korea veteran answered in a rasped whisper, he means transfer. Show respect. Blake did not speak. Silence in that moment carried more force than rebuttal. Klein's assistant touched his sleeve, murmuring something about legal exposure, cameras, optics. Klein shrugged the hand off without looking. He set his jaw, stepped in again, and nudged the rope with his thigh. The stanchion rocked. Chrome rang once against tile. Ava's shoulders tightened. From the side access corridor came the growing cadence of incoming boots and the clipped murmur of Federal radios syncing channels. It was close now, not distant. 30 seconds, perhaps less. Klein lifted his chin and pointed directly at Blake's chest. Move, toy soldier! The insult hung in fluorescent air. Blake's eyes locked on Klein's forward foot crossing line geometry. By inches, threshold nearing, legal and moral lines converging to one point. He could feel the corridor watching him. Veterans, cadets, families, officers, travelers pulled from gates and coffee lines into a lesson they had not expected to receive today. He could also feel the unseen weight behind him, heavier than cameras and command arrivals, older than this terminal, older than this man's fortune. The unreturned dead, the folded flags, the names on stones, the unnamed resting under marble. Klein shifted his weight and drove his foot toward the restricted lane again, aiming to step over the rope and through the space reserved for the fallen. Blake Hassan remained outwardly motionless for one final breath, every instinct aligned, ready to answer with disciplined force the instant the line was crossed. Klein's shoe broke the vertical plane of the rope by a single step, and Blake Hassan moved. It was one stride, nothing wasted, the kind of movement that looked simple only to people who had never trained a body to obey law under pressure. His right foot drove forward and planted on tile with a clean, controlled stop. His torso turned just enough to close the gap. His chest met Klein's shoulder line in a firm block that redirected momentum without a strike, without a grab, without a single break in professional bearing. The rope snapped taut behind Blake's calf and settled. Chrome stanchions rattled once and held. Gasps cracked through the corridor in one sharp wave. Ava clutched her mother's coat. The cadets at the back straightened as if a command had been issued straight into their spines. The Korea veteran's cane tip clicked tile when his grip shifted. Darla Finch from TSA put her cap under one arm and exhaled through clenched teeth, eyes fixed on Blake as if she were watching a lock and gauge on a vault. Klein froze against the block, stunned less by force than by refusal. He had expected either deference or argument. He got discipline. Blake's face remained carved and unreadable beneath the kepi brim. His voice came out low, formal, and final, each word spaced with military cadence. "This lane belongs to the fallen. You will stand down now." No echo. No shouting match. Just that sentence hanging in jet fuel air like a flag dropping to half-staff. Klein's chin jerked up. "You can put hands on me." Blake did not retreat a fraction. "You crossed a restricted military transfer route." Klein angled to step around him. Blake shifted half a step and sealed the lane again, chest square, posture upright, hands still visible, and open at seam height. Minimum force, maximum clarity, no theatrics, no anger, no humiliation in his expression, only enforcement. The toy soldier, kicked moments earlier, sat near the inside edge of the cordon by Blake's left shoe, tiny and green against polished gray tile. Blake tracked it in his peripheral vision alongside Klein's wrists and shoulders, alongside Ava's position at the rail, alongside the side access door where command footsteps were already closing. At 10:17 and 31 seconds, those footsteps arrived. The side door swung open with a hard hydraulic sigh, and Brigadier General Eleanor Whitaker entered flanked by 2 federal police officers and an airport federal security supervisor carrying a tablet already awake with multi-angle video feeds. Whitaker wore her service uniform under a dark overcoat, ribbons precise, silver hair pinned tight, command presence filling the corridor before she spoke. Her eyes took one sweep. Rope line, Blake's position, Klein's posture, child at rail, toy on floor, witnesses packed 3 deep. "Hold this scene," she ordered. The federal officers moved instantly, one to Klein's right flank, one to his rear quarter, palms visible, voices calm. "Sir, step back from the barrier. Now!" Klein spread his hands in disbelief. "General, thank God. Tell your ceremonial guard to stand down. I'm being obstructed." Whitaker did not look at him first. She looked at Blake. "Staff Sergeant Hassan, status." Blake answered without inflection. "Subject attempted repeated breach of restricted lane during active dignified transfer. Minor was struck during that breach sequence. Subject entered lane threshold. I executed non-striking block and verbal stand-down." Whitaker gave one clipped nod. "Maintain position." Then she turned to the federal supervisor with the tablet. "Play it from 2 minutes prior." The screen brightened in the sterile light. Camera 1 showed Klein shoving the rope. Camera 2 showed Ava's toy slipping from her hand after his sleeve clipped her wrist. Camera 3 caught the kick, clear as day, and the attempted step through the restricted line. Camera 4 showed Blake's stride and block. Controlled, proportionate, textbook. Whispers moved through the crowd like wind through headstones. "He kicked it. That's the little girl's." "He warned him twice." Klein pointed at the tablet. "This is selective. I have clearances at levels you do not want to test." Whitaker's voice cooled by degrees. "Clearance does not supersede a dignified transfer corridor. Ever." One of Klein's assistants leaned in, trying to lower the temperature. "General, perhaps we can resolve this privately. Mr. Klein has an urgent defense procurement summit." Whitaker's gaze never left the assistant until he stepped back on his own. "What will happen now is not private." The federal officer at Klein's flank spoke formally. "Mr. Victor Klein, you are being detained pending referral for interference with military operations and for physical contact involving a minor in a restricted federal zone. Turn and place your hands where I can see them." Klein barked a short laugh that landed flat. "Detained? For touching a rope?" The officer answered, for your actions on camera and your conduct after repeated lawful directives. Klein tried to step backward into open space, then saw the second officer already there. His assistants fell silent. The airport liaison lowered his eyes. Blake remained exactly where he was, lane sealed, breathing even, gaze forward. To the crowd, he looked immovable. Inside, every system stayed active until command released him. Hand lines, spacing, child safety, transfer timing. He could feel Hale's memory like a steady pressure behind the sternum. Not a wound now, but a bearing. Hold the line. Protect the ones who cannot protect themselves. Do the job clean. Whitaker extended her hand toward the toy soldier without bending. Do not disturb that item until photographed. The federal supervisor snapped 3 quick images, then a 4th with scale marker. He knelt, bagged the toy in a clear evidence sleeve, labeled it with time and location, and passed it to a military police sergeant for chain of custody notation. Elena Monroe watched that process with trembling restraint, one hand over Ava's fingers, as if teaching her that even small things were treated with respect here. Ava looked up at Blake, then at the bagged toy, then back to Blake. She did not cry. She stood very still, mirroring him in miniature. 38 seconds after Whitaker's arrival, another military police team entered from the loading corridor and reported the transfer vehicle 2 minutes out. The clock on the wall read 10:18. Timelines were tight, but intact. Whitaker issued commands like hammer strikes. Federal police, remove Mr. Klein from this corridor. Liaison, preserve access logs and escort records. TSA Supervisor Finch, remain for statement. Sergeant Cole, collect witness names from the Gold Star section and cadet group. No media comments from anyone in this hall until legal brief is issued. Yes, ma'am, answered from 4 directions. Klein's voice rose as officers guided him toward the side door. You have no idea what this does to current contracts. Call the deputy secretary. Call anyone above this. Whitaker stepped into his line of sight and gave him the kind of stare that ended arguments in command tents and hearing rooms alike. I know exactly what this does. It confirms that in this uniformed corridor, honor outranks ego. Klein opened his mouth again. She cut him off with a final order. Remove him. The officers escorted him out, controlled and firm. No spectacle, no roughness, just us. Consequence. The door closed behind them and the corridor exhaled. A murmur broke from the witnesses, not celebratory, more like pressure leaving a sealed chamber. The Korea veteran removed his cap and held it over his heart. One cadet whispered, Yes, ma'am, to nobody in particular. Darla Finch wiped her eyes once with the heel of her hand, then straightened and prepared her statement. Whitaker faced the crowd. The transfer remains on schedule. Thank you for holding this space with dignity. She turned to Elena and lowered her voice respectful. Mrs. Monroe, your daughter's item has been documented and will be returned through proper process after legal intake. I'm sorry this happened in front of her. Elena nodded, throat tight. Thank you, General. Whitaker's expression softened a fraction when she addressed Ava directly. You did nothing wrong, young lady. You were brave. Ava looked at Blake again before answering. He was brave. No one corrected her. Whitaker stepped back to Blake's position. For one moment, she let command tone give way to soldiers' recognition. Staff Sergeant Hassan, your response was precise and lawful. You protected the lane, the family, and the transfer timeline. Well done. Blake gave a single crisp acknowledgement. Thank you, ma'am. Remain on post until relieved, Whitaker said, then pivoted toward the incoming transfer team. By 10:20, the corridor had reordered itself around purpose. Military police reset the rope stanchion to exact alignment. The evidence log was signed by 2 witnessing officers. Federal security confirmed preservation of all 4 camera feeds and uploaded copies to Command Legal. Statements began in sequence. Finch first, then the airport liaison, then the veteran in the Korea cap, then 2 cadets, each account matching the footage in timing and detail. No loose facts, no room for spin. From beyond the loading door came the low rumble of the transport vehicle and the synchronized cadence of the escort team. Every person in the hall felt it before they saw it. Backs straightened, voices ended, hats came off, phones disappeared. Blake resumed full ceremonial stillness at the lane edge, as if the confrontation had never occurred, though everyone present now understood the cost of that stillness in a way they had not 10 minutes earlier. He stood with white gloves pristine, uniform immaculate, face unreadable, and eyes fixed on duty while grief and witness gathered behind him. Ava shifted one small step closer to the rail and whispered, barely audible, "He stood watch." Helena squeezed her shoulder, and the words settled over the corridor like a benediction as the doors opened for the fallen. The flag-draped transfer case crossed the threshold on the shoulders of the team, and the corridor locked into a silence so complete that even the ventilation hum seemed to recede. Blake pivoted to ceremonial alignment at the lane edge, boots planted, chin level, rifle absent now, but discipline no less absolute. The escort moved in measured cadence, each step synchronized, each face set in the solemn focus of men carrying more than weight. Eleanor Monroe bowed her head. Ava stood on her toes to see, her small hand wrapped in her mother's coat sleeve, eyes wide and steady. No one spoke until the case reached the waiting vehicle cradle, and the command to secure was given. The metallic latches clicked shut with clean finality. A chaplain in dark uniform stepped forward and offered a brief prayer, voice low, words plain, gratitude for service, mercy for grief, strength for the family, honor for the nation's dead. When he finished, hats rose only after a beat of stillness that felt earned. Brigadier General Whitaker gave a subtle signal to resume movement. The family lane opened. Elena and Ava were guided toward the procession van while military police held the perimeter with respectful distance. Blake remained where ordered until relieved, but he tracked Ava's last glance over her shoulder. She found him immediately. 6 years old, face tired, she raised her empty hand in a tiny salute she had learned by observation rather than instruction. Blake did not break bearing, yet he gave the smallest permissible incline of his chin. For her, it was answer enough. 2 minutes later, Sergeant Cole stepped into Blake's peripheral field and assumed his position for turnover. "Staff Sergeant Hassan, I have the line." Blake executed the relief sequence by regulation and stepped clear. The corridor exhaled into movement again, but never into disorder. By early afternoon, the fluorescent annex had become a command workspace. Statements continued behind closed doors, each witness seated one at a time under a wall clock that seemed louder than before. Darla Finch confirmed what she had seen and signed without revision. The Korea veteran, Harold Benton, gave his account in a voice that trembled only on the sentence about the child's toy. The cadets matched one another on timing to the second. The airport liaison, Martin Reeve, admitted he had expedited Klein's side access against his better judgment after pressure from Klein's office and a call from an executive scheduler. He accepted written reprimand on the spot and submitted the call log voluntarily. He had worn a look of unfinished speech in the corridor, and now he finished it plainly to Whitaker. "Ma'am, I knew it was wrong the moment he said, 'Move the military lane.' I should have shut it down before he reached the rope." "You will include that in your sworn addendum," Whitaker said. "Yes, ma'am." In the legal intake room, the evidence sleeve containing Ava's soldier was opened under camera, photographed front and back, and examined for damage. The toy's left leg had cracked at the thigh seam, and a chip marked the helmet rim. Chain of custody remained intact. Initially received and sealed by the military police sergeant at scene, transferred to the federal supervisor for joint intake, logged by Sergeant Cole, transferred to Command Legal at 10:32, reviewed at 13:07. Whitaker signed the release authorization to return it to the family once documentation cleared. Blake, offline but still on duty cycle, requested permission through proper channel to coordinate repair before return. Whitaker studied him for one quiet second. "For the record, Staff Sergeant, why?" Blake answered in the same measured cadence he used under pressure. "Because she offered it in honor, ma'am. It deserves to be returned in honor." Whitaker's expression softened, then reset to command. "Approved. Keep the documentation complete." Klein's assistant, who had whispered about optics, never offered another challenge. He sat with counsel in a separate room and declined to amend his first statement. The partial camera occlusion he had caused from one angle proved irrelevant, because the overhead feed captured the kick and breach attempt without ambiguity. By 1540, the preliminary referral package was transmitted. Interference with military operations, assault complaint involving contact with a minor, and administrative notice to suspend active terminal privileges pending adjudication. A procurement office called twice requesting clarification. Both calls were routed to legal and answered with the same line. Review in progress, access suspended. No one overwrote it. At 1712, after signatures, scans, and final release stamps, the evidence status changed from retained to returned with documentation. Sergeant Cole handed Blake the toy in a padded envelope, along with the printout showing every transfer point and timestamp. Nothing was loose. Nothing was missing. Blake carried it to the old guard workshop on post, where a retired ordnance technician named Mr. Leland Price still volunteered 3 evenings a week, repairing ceremonial fixtures and memorial displays with patient hands. Price turned the tiny soldier under a bench lamp, glasses low on his nose. "Clean break," he said. "Can be set right." "It needs to hold," Blake replied. Price gave him a thin, approving smile. "Then we pin and bond, not just glue." For 40 minutes, they worked in companionable silence, broken only by tool clicks and the faint hiss of a heat pen. A steel micro-pin set through the broken seam, a careful resin join, a color match on the chipped helmet edge. Price even buffed old scuffs from the toy's base until the little figure stood straighter than before. Blake then moved to the engraving station and prepared a small walnut shadow box from unused stock, lining it in dark felt. On a brass plate, he typed the words with deliberate pressure. He stood watch. Below it, smaller, given in honor by Ava Monroe. By the second evening hour, graveside honors were assembling beneath a sky washed violet by the setting sun. The wind had turned cooler, carrying the scent of cut grass and damp earth through rows of white markers that caught the last light like quiet fire. A military chaplain stood near the grave team. A bugler waited at respectful distance. Families gathered in black coats, shoulders touching for strength. Harold Benton, Korea cap in hand, stood among them. Invited by Elena after seeing him in the corridor, he had asked for nothing, only said, "No family should stand alone." Blake approached in service dress, posture formal, shadow box held at chest height. He waited until the final words of the committal prayer had been spoken and the flag presentation concluded. Elena accepted the folded flag with both hands, face composed until composure finally broke and returned in the same breath. Ava stood beside her, exhausted but upright, curls loosened by wind. When the chaplain stepped back, Blake took 2 measured steps forward and lowered himself to one knee so his eyes were level with Ava's. "Miss Monroe," he said, voice quiet but clear, "this belongs to you." He opened the box. Under the soft portable lights, the green soldier stood repaired and mounted. No crack visible unless searched for closely. Brass plate gleaming with the engraved words. Ava looked from the toy to Blake, then to her mother, then back to the plate. She traced the letters with one fingertip. "He stood watch," she read, careful and slow. "Yes," Blake said. "He did." Ava swallowed, then asked the question that had lived in her since morning. "For my dad, too?" Blake held her gaze, the same gaze that had faced gunfire and grief and never looked away from truth. "For your dad, too. And for every one of them." Elena covered her mouth, tears slipping through her fingers. Harold Benton removed his cap and bowed his head. Even Mr. Price, who had come quietly and stood in the back, cleared his throat and looked at the ground. Ava stepped forward and, with all the ceremony a 6-year-old could summon, offered Blake a solemn nod that echoed the salute she had given in the terminal. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant." Blake rose and answered with a precise incline of his head. "It is my honor." Taps sounded then, pure and aching in the dusk, notes carrying across the hillside and settling into the spaces between stones. No one hurried to leave after the last note faded. They stood together in the cooling air, family and strangers, veterans and sentinels, held in one shared silence that needed no explanation. Before dawn the next morning, Arlington lay under a thin veil of mist again, pale light just beginning to gather along marble edges. The plaza stones were still damp, and the flag above the terrace moved in a steady, deliberate wind. Blake Hassan stepped onto the black mat in full sentinel uniform, every crease exact, white gloves pristine, kepi brim true. Whatever had been loud in the world beyond the gates had no authority here. His boots clicked in perfect rhythm. 21 steps, pause, turn, repeat. At the rail, a small cluster of early visitors watched in reverent quiet. A father with coffee gone cold in his hand, 2 cadets standing straighter than yesterday, Harold Benton with his Korea cap pressed over his heart, and Elena with Ava wrapped in a navy coat against the chill. Ava held the shadow box carefully, with both hands, the brass plate catching first light. She did not call out. She did not wave. She simply stood and watched the sentinel keep his vow. Blake reached the 21st step, halted, turned with mechanical precision, and began again. Marble, mist, headstones, flag, boots on stone. The sacred order held. The dead were honored. The living learned how. And the man on the mat, carved from discipline and memory, stood watch for the known and the unknown alike.